The Art and Times of the Guitar by Frederick v. Grunsfeld, Chapter 8, Part 4. The Guitar in America. The circumstance that the guitar could articulate, or sigh, or wail, or tremble like the human voice under emotion made it the ideal blues instrument. Of Charlie Patton, the earliest major figure mentioned in Samuel Charter's History the Bluesmen, a fellow musician reported, "He used to play the guitar, and he'd make the guitar say, 'Lord have mercy, Lord have mercy, Lord have mercy. Pray, brother, pray, save poor me.'" Now that's what Charlie Patton'd make the guitar say. Indeed, long before the white churches began to consider the possibility of revitalizing their liturgy with the guitar, it had already emerged as the mainstay of certain black gospel sects who brought the instrument back into a church setting for the first time since the days when angels with vihuelas frequented the belens of Spanish cathedrals. Brother John Sellers explains. The Holy Roller Church. You know, they call them sanctified holy rollers. Well, this is the church that I belong to, where we play the tambourines and the guitars and the horns. And the reason we play these instruments is because we get it from the 150th Psalm of David. You know, praise the Lord, with the hand clapping, with the shaking of cymbals, with the tambourines and the guitars. There was another old Spanish custom that was revived in the new world of the blues guitar. Uptown in New Orleans, they had a lot of country guitar players used to come to town and sit around, and in barber shops, you know, and play the ragtime. Pianist Charles Love told Paul Oliver, Conversation with the Blues. They hear bands playing, they sit around in the barber shops, and if they catch the piece, they pick it out on the guitar. In such eminently musical circumstances, it was only natural that the guitar should have played a prominent role in the genesis of jazz, especially at those historic $1.50 a couple picnics held on the outskirts of New Orleans where some of the first jazz was blown. But the acoustic guitar was never really loud enough to hold its own against such stentorian partners as the trumpet, cornet, trombone, and clarinet, which commanded a decisively majority in the early jazz band. The very sensitivity and expressiveness that were its great advantages for the blues, a personal, painful, introverted form of folk art, made the guitar less than ideal for jazz, which was essentially music for extroverts and virtuosos. Soon the guitar was being outshouted in the rhythm section by the banjo and the piano. Although there were a number of pioneers in the field like Lonnie Johnson, who became famous thumping a guitar with Charlie Creeth's band on the Mississippi riverboats, the first jazz band to elevate the guitar into independent status was Eddie Lang, 1903 to 1933, who founded a melodic single-string style, punteado as opposed to rasgado in the older terminology, fusing jazz with the Italian popular guitar. Both Eddie Condon and Freddie Green distinguished themselves in the medium during the 1930s. Green, according to Nat Hentoff, being the ex-rhythm guitar, but it was not until the advent of Charlie Christian and almost simultaneously the emergence of the electric guitar that the jazz guitar finally came of age. Christian's life was tragically short. Born in Dallas in 1919, he grew up in Oklahoma City, began playing professionally in his teens, joined Betty Goodman's band at 20, and died of tuberculosis at 23 in 1942. Yet there was a time for him to revolutionize the technique of the jazz guitar, and at after-hours sessions at Minton's Playhouse, Harlem, with Dizzy Gillespie, Charlie Parker, Thelonious Monk, et al. To help launch the nervous, electrically charged new style which he himself christened bebop. He had begun on acoustic plectrum guitar, producing a sound just able to hold up its end of the more refined jazz conversations. But in 1937, he was introduced to the electric guitar by Eddie Durham, a trombonist and arranger, as well as a guitarist. He, Christian, had big eyes to sound like a saxophone, Durham later remembered, and I showed him how, by using downstrokes, he could get a sharper tone, and how, on a downstroke only, the player could get a more legato effect while the strings were bouncing, back as the hand was on its way up. To realize his ambition of sounding like a saxophone, Christian handled the sharp, whining sonorities of the electric guitar primarily as a melody instrument, playing with extraordinary freedom and imagination. He is admired too for his arcane sense of harmony, for basing his improvisations not merely on the standard chord progressions of his themes, but on altered chords and passing notes deftly slipped in between the lines. His few treasured recordings constitute the great divide of the jazz guitar. There is the guitar before Christian and the guitar after Christian, and they sound virtually like two different instruments. The post-Christian era has produced a spate of notable guitarists, including Wes Montgomery, Barney Kessel, Kenny Burrell, Jim Hall, Jimmy Rainey, Johnny Smith, Tal Farlow, Herb Ellis, Charlie Byrd, and Laurindo Almeida, who doubles in classics. Montgomery, who used a light, swift thumb instead of a plectrum, ranked as the leading jazz guitarist of the 1960s. He died suddenly and far too prematurely, in 1968 at the age of 45. With electric amplification, jazz guitarists have now been playing louder than anyone else in the band for 30 years, with the predictable result that the instrument has become far more assertive in character and now fills as important a musical role as the saxophone, clarinet, or piano. Yet oddly enough, there has been no really commanding avant-garde figure. Since Christian. In fact, the only other guitarist to have earned that rather too loosely applied jazz adjective great was the improbable Django Reinhardt, 1910 to 1953, a European, an outsider even in his own country, a Belgian-born French gypsy with no discernible connection to the jazz tradition. As if those were not enough strikes against him, Reinhardt also lost the use of two fingers of his left hand, but he worked his way around that problem with a brilliantly resourceful style, modeled on Eddie Lang's single-string technique. His playing also reflected gypsy influences, though of the Central European rather than the Spanish flamenco variety. His famous quintet of the Hot Club de France, made up entirely of strings, 3 guitars, violin, and bass, was easily the best of all the European jazz groups, precisely because it was never intended to produce an ersatz American sound. Reinhardt took up the electric guitar only after World War II, when he came briefly to the United States to play with Duke Ellington. Like Christian, he won a place in the jazz hagiography, largely through his recordings, which have exerted an immense posthumous influence. Significantly, the most successful piece by John Lewis and the modern jazz quartet is named Django in his honor.